Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Soy Aquaculture Alliance's seminar this morning or afternoon, wherever you may be in the world. It's entitled Feeding New Opportunities, and it's focused on aquaculture nutrition. My name is Courtney Knupp, and I'll serve as your moderator. I'm with the U.S. Soybean Export Council, and I'm the Director of Global Nutrition Programs, which we focus on how soybean meal is utilized in terrestrial animals, but also aquaculture. So it's a real pleasure for USEC to partner with an organization like the Soy Aquaculture Alliance, as we both are focused on asking key questions that will help us get more information, research, and answers towards growing more productive aquaculture operations and associated products for global consumers. So this half-day event brings together individuals from feed companies, from aquaculture researchers, nutrition experts, and aquaculture company leaders to discuss industry challenges, research outcomes, and ongoing efforts to create connections. The intent of this meeting is to generate discussion that leads to expanded use of soybeans in aquaculture diets by addressing the perceived or actual hurdles to inclusion. The Soy Aquaculture Alliance will identify opportunities to support research and education and conversations that will address the gaps identified. SAA really serves as the needed bridge to encourage connections and open the dialogue between these segments. And this event is in alignment with the mission of the organization statement to expand the use of U.S. grown soybeans in domestic aquaculture diets through research, promotion, and collaboration. So thank you all for joining. I want to turn it over to SAA's chair, but a couple housekeeping items first. You all as attendees have been muted. When people are presenting, they'll be unmuted. This webinar will be recorded and we will be uploading it to SAA's website, which is soyaquaculture.org. And for any questions, so that we can have a dialogue throughout the conversation this morning, please use the Q&A function. And if you're using a phone or afterwards you have key questions, please send an email to info@soyaquaculture.org. So with that, we are going to move into some opening remarks from the Soy Aquaculture Alliance Chair, Jerry Bombauer.
Hello, and welcome to Feeding New Opportunities, Aquaculture Nutrition Forum. My name is Jerry Bombauer, Chair of the Board of Directors for the Soy Aquaculture Alliance. SAA is dedicated to expanding the use of U.S. grown soybeans in domestic aquaculture. Soybeans and fish may seem like unlikely partners, but bringing the land and the sea together offers major opportunities for both. Soy Aquaculture Alliance Board is made up of U.S. soybean farmers and industry members. We each see the need to look for expanded market opportunities for our products. Soy has long been a feedstuff for land-raised livestock. Why not for farm-raised aquatic animals? The U.S. produces the most consistent, dependable soybeans in the world. So feeding domestic soy to domestic fish just makes sense. How we get there? Higher inclusion rates, better diets, more species is all based on research. And that research starts with good questions. We spent the last several years investing in that research and moving the needle forward on improved diets with a consistent feed source, soybeans. Today, you'll hear from some of the industry's top minds, and we hope this generates some more questions, and we welcome them. This event is designed to spark conversations, foster ideas, and better spur recommendations for our continued investment in research that will support better use of soybeans in aquacultural diets. I'd like to welcome and thank our moderator this morning, Courtney Knupp, USEC Focus Area Coordinator, Animal Aquaculture Feed. And thanks you all for joining us today. And we hope that you will continue to be involved in the conversations in coming months and years. Thanks again for being part of our seminar today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry. A little bit about the run of show today. We're going to have three different panels, three key aspects of how it help to advance the U.S. aquaculture industry. The first will be on research, the second, nutritionist, and the third will be an industry panel. So moving into the research panel, we have three great speakers here today. They're going to give a little presentation from their perspective. And again, please use the chat function for Q&A. So brief introductions, and then I will let them take it away. We have Paul Brown. He's a professor of fisheries and aquatic sciences at Purdue University. We have Vikas Kumar. He's an assistant professor at the University of Idaho. And we have Ken Overturf, who is a research geneticist with the United States Department of Agriculture based in Idaho. So with that, I'm going to turn over for the first presentation to Paul. Paul, please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you, Courtney, and good morning, everyone. Courtney, can I communicate with you real quickly? Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, you're great.
Okay, let's start screen sharing. Okay, Courtney, once again, can everybody see that?
Yes, it is up there. So if you put it in presentation mode, you are ready to go.
Trying to. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure being here today. I'm going to give the 30,000-foot view of aquaculture because I know a lot of people are probably interested in perhaps making some aquaculture feeds, but it seems to always be beneficial to make sure that everybody's on the same page because it is significantly different from feeding terrestrial animals. For example, we have literally thousands of species being raised in aquaculture. This is a real challenge. They all act like pretty good non-ruminant animals. So that's beneficial for those of you who might be poultry or swine nutritionists. At the same time, there's some real variation in this. For example, we have a whole family of fishes that are stomaчлess fishes. So you don't have the acid secretions and things like that. The other big difference you've got is that the optimal dietary crude protein concentration is very high. The 28% is a difficult feed to even find. The more common ones on the low end are 32%, and they go way up from there. Also, the optimal dietary lipid concentration is very high. So we've got a fundamental basal formulation difference between aquatic and terrestrial animals. The other big issue is that the ability to utilize dietary carbohydrates varies quite a bit, but it is not considered to be very high. So carbohydrates are not a great energy source for most of the aquatic animals that we raise. This is the fundamental issue that we've addressed since I've been exposed to aquaculture nutrition. That is the global supply of fish meal and fish oil. And there's a common date I'm going to emphasize a couple of times. It's about 1989, 1990. We pretty much reached the maximum supply of fish meal and fish oil on a global scale. At the same time, aquaculture has been growing significantly since then. And fish meal, fish oil are great ingredients for aquatic animals. So we knew we were going to have a fish meal, fish oil problem, and alternative protein sources have been a focal area of almost all of us who work in the area of aquaculture nutrition. At the same time, here's a rough graph we put together a long time ago, because when I see these values, for example, that top one is the global harvest of commercial species, about 90 million metric tons. And we wanted to put that in some kind of perspective to the global production of swine and chickens. And that's the next two lines you see down there. And the bottom line is aquaculture growth. It's just obviously a dated graph at this point in time. But again, that 1990 date, that's when aquaculture really started to expand significantly. More recently, this is a graph that came out more recently, and farm fish now has overtaken the global production of beef cattle. So this industry globally is growing at a very rapid rate, and its rapid rate continues to this day. When we look at alternative protein sources, soy is an easy one. It was easy for me because I'm right here in the middle of the Midwestern soy belt, corn soy belt. But if you look at it, again, on a global scale, the supply is simply much, much higher. That supply is just like it was for swine and poultry. It's beneficial for aquaculture because that equates to good supplies and price stability. And I'll chuckle and you chuckle as well when we talk about soybean price stability. Every soybean farmer I've ever talked to just starts laughing when I say that. But the other good thing is, I mean, here's why I say that. Historically, the soybean production and usage graphs are very close to each other. So again, that results in some stability. The soy complex, USB, the state qualified boards, they all do a great job of expanding markets while the supply is also increasing. So this production usage comparison, again, results in plenty of supply and, again, price stability. And here's why you have to keep in mind when we talk about price volatility. Here's the fish meal and fish oil price volatilities. So again, go back to about 1989 or so. There's a significant increase in fish meal and fish oil prices. They pretty much doubled in price. So from our perspective, when we talk about price volatility, that's the type of price volatility we've had to live with in aquaculture. Not a couple dollars per bushel, but a doubling of price in a very short period of time. That's when aquaculture started to grow. And then again, you've seen a steady increase with a slight dips right around the turn of the century to the point now where we knew where we were going to be a long time ago. Fish meal, fish oil prices trading at well over $1,000 per ton. So that really challenges the economics of aquaculture and inhibits aquaculture growth, further growth. So we have to have alternative ingredients. That's all there is to it. So what do we know and what have we learned? And I think there's an important lesson that we learned from the U.S. channel catfish industry. There was a concerted effort to evolve to a corn soy-based diet, away from a fish meal, fish oil diet. And that's as the industry was growing in the 1980s, early 1990s. Turns out the catfish is a more omnivorous species. And keep in mind that most of our aquatic animals are either carnivorous or omnivorous. We've got a few herbivores, but very few in the aquatic world. Turns out the catfish is pretty tolerant of anti-nutritional factors in the solvent extracted dehulled soybean meal. And that form of soybean meal has been the focal point. The lower protein with the hull still in it has not been a serious consideration in the aquaculture feed industry, again, because of the very high protein concentrations that we have. So when I say soybean meal, I'm referring to the solvent extracted dehulled soybean meal. We found that channel catfish will tolerate up to 40 to 50% incorporation of soybean meal. And that became the base formulation for the catfish industry and allowed that industry to grow significantly in the US and now in Southeast Asia as well. The basal formulation is about a 32-4. So that is the low end of the feeds base formulations you'll see in aquaculture. 32% crude protein, 4% crude lipid. Now that diet has been very beneficial to several other global industries, particularly the tilapias and the cyprinids. Let me address tilapia first, and then I'll define cyprinids for you. The tilapia is a global aquaculture industry. Most of those producers and most of the feed mills increase the protein and fat above the basal catfish formulation to about 36.6. It's become pretty common. And the cyprinids is a very large family of fishes. It's one of the largest family of fishes. There are over 1,200 species of cyprinids. And from a nomenclature point of view, these are the minnows of the world. But some of these minnows also get to be a couple of meters long. So the minnows that you might think of in North America, they get pretty large in other situations. In food fish aquaculture, these are the common carps, the Asian carps, and the Indian carps. And collectively, those are the three largest aquaculture industries on the planet. We raise more Indian carps, Asian carps, and common carps than any other species. So we're actually able to feed relatively low protein, low fat feeds to these larger industries. However, we've got another group of fishes that are highly marketable, preferred in a lot of different markets, and that's the salmonids. And again, this salmonid, that term salmonid means a family of fishes. It includes all the trout and salmon, and it turns out, unless you're a trout angler, you may not be familiar with all the various species of trout, as well as a lot of different species of salmon. Turned out that the salmonids were sensitive to soybean meal. You'll hear later from Dr. Overturf about some of his increases in soy use in salmonids, but for the most part, we're looking at 15% of the diet or less. The basal macronutrient formulations for the trout, particularly trout, vary quite a bit more than we see for the catfish, tilapia, cyprinid diets. You'll find some trout diets as low as 36% protein, as high as 46. You'll see fat ratios that range from 12 to 24%. A good median value that seems to be out there is about a 42-18. And to get more than 18% fat in an extruded fish feed is sometimes problematic for some mills. It's hard, it's difficult to do that without specialty equipment. But a 42-18 formulation has become pretty common, at least here in the US. And we've known all along that the soy protein concentrates and isolates work very well. No major problems nutritionally, but they were cost prohibitive. We evaluated one many years ago now with a former group called Central Soya, and it worked very well, but we were looking at very low levels of inclusion, less than 5%. And it worked well at that time. Soy protein concentrates were traded at over $1,000 per ton. Fish meal prices were much lower, so it didn't make economic sense at that time to use those. This economic situation has changed, obviously, as you already heard, so that soy protein concentrates now are a viable option. So we've got essentially two basic formulations. This is the argument I continue to make. We've got omnivorous diets and we've got carnivorous diets. So you just heard your board chair say, what about new and emerging species? We want to see aquaculture in the US grow. Can we use either of these two types of feeds, or do we need a specialty feed for these new and emerging species? We've done a lot of work in this area, started with hybrid striped bass funded by the Indiana Soybean Board. And here's some of the initial studies that we always approached, feeding practical diets. And the numbers in parentheses there are protein fat concentrations. So what you're seeing is some catfish, tilapia-like formulations, as well as that 55-15. That was a salmon diet at the time. And then look at weight gain. Dramatically different weight gain in a carnivorous cool water fish diet. Same thing happened with our yellow perch evaluations. Tilapia-like diets, they grew, but then you get up into a more trout-like diet, they grew even better. A yellow perch is an interesting species because we have a significant slowdown in growth once they hit about 50 grams. So we've gotten far more extensive with our evaluations then with catfish versus trout and salmon-like diets. And you look at that bottom one there, a good 32, 3.5, that's a good catfish diet. We had 10% weight gain over about a 2-month period. So again, do the catfish diets work for yellow perch? I have to recommend that they don't. More trout-like diets are working much better. And we've seen this continually with a lot of our new species. More carnivorous species, the trout basal formulations tend to promote far greater weight gain. So the question, I'm getting some feedback, Courtney. So the question is, are the optimal macronutrient concentrations that variable across species? And they could easily be, or are the targeted species sensitive to soybean products? So we had, again, a series of studies evaluating soy products in a number of different species. With the hybrid striped bass, we could go up to as high as 40% soybean meal, which is a very high level of inclusion for a carnivorous species. Yellow perch turned out was more sensitive. which surprised us. Only about 30% level of inclusion was they're going to tolerate. So we've got species about differences and different sensitivities.
Yep.
So I started soy and aquaculture managed.
Oh, Paul, this is Courtney.
We're
hitting our time. I know 10 minutes is never enough. However, your thorough slides will be on the website. And I think you've posed a lot of questions. I know I wrote a couple down. Do you have any summary points you'd like to kind of end on before we turn it over to Vikas?
Yep, right here. I started the soy and aquaculture program in 2001, ran it through 2008. We focused on salmonids and marine shrimp because those were the two large global industries that at that time were underutilized in soybean meal and diets. So we did a lot of work with salmonids, a lot of work with marine shrimp. I think we were very successful with the marine shrimp because shrimp turned out very tolerant. And now they're using very high levels of soybean meal and shrimp. So here's all the questions that you posed. And I have to say that it all depends. It's highly variable. It depends on which species you're talking about. And with that, I'll turn it over to Vikas.
Thank you so much, Paul. We appreciate those insights. Again, any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A. And next, we'll turn it over to Vikas Kumar, with assistant professor with the University of Idaho, so going west across the United States.
All right. Thank you, Courtney. Let me share my screen first. Is it good?
Yes, it is.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. It will be great. It's my pleasure to share some of my experience, especially with the soy protein in aquafeed. And good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of you. Thank you for your time to have you here on my talk. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about only soy protein, and I'm going to talk especially what I have done so far in last 5 to 10 years. So we had great support from Kentucky Soybean Board, USEC, Ohio Soybean Council, Soy Aquaculture Alliance. Thank you for the support. And so we'll share some of our results, what we have done. Before we go to the real number, I would like to give you some flavor about aquaculture, how the aquaculture is growing and why they are much efficient. As you know, aquaculture is one of the fastest growing food industry in the world. It provides you more than 50% fish for human food, and it is a much efficient animal. Aquatic animals are much efficient animal. If you look at the feed efficiency for aquatic animals, they are way, way better than terrestrial animals. That's why aquaculture is growing way faster than other food industry. I don't want to go much detail about the aquaculture, but I want to talk about how the aquafeed industry has been changed over the time. Yeah, you know, the major revolution happened in aquafeed industry in 1970, 1980s, when you got to know everything about the aquatic animals requirement, especially the macro and micronutrient requirement, and where the commercial producer started to making diet to grow the animals. So if you look at the 1990s, we used to use almost 70% fish meal in our aquatic animals food, almost 70%. But right now we are using around 20 to 25%. If you look at this number, 31%, anyway, this figure has been taken from a web page that is called some sources, but I'm not very much pleased with this number, 31% fish meal right now. I believe right now we are using around 20 to 25% fish meal on an average in aquafeed industry. However, these things can be turned around in future by 2030. It will be almost 70% aquafeed will be dominated by plant ingredients, especially corn and soybean meal and other plant ingredients. What we'll have is the only 10% we will have is fish meal. So that's the future for aquafeed industry. So how much we are producing right now, aquafeed industry? Right now, around 60 to 65 million metric ton. This data is based on my calculation. So I believe right now we have aquafeed production is about 60 to 65 million metric ton. It's a billion dollar industry. Last year, aquafeed market size was around $66.1 billion. And we are expecting in another 6 years, it will be almost $90 billion industry. So the market size is pretty good. So as I mentioned, the plant ingredients are dominating in aquafeed industry. Which one is number 1 and 2? So top 2 are corn and soy. So why soy is great? What is the beauty behind the soybean meal or soybean seed? Soybean seed is a great source of oil. It has a lot of pharmaceutical application. I don't want to go much detail about it. But what I care about is that once you take out the oil from the seed, what you have left over is the seed meal that is called soybean meal. And it is well balanced with amino acid. It has high amount of protein, almost 50% protein. Then why can't we use into the aquatic animals diet? What's the problem? The problem is there are some drawbacks. There are some limitations. What are those limitations? There are some limitations. For example, soybean meal has trypsin inhibitor and lactin. That's not a big deal. We can get rid of toasting. Once you put in the oven, it's gone. Phytate, it's around 2 to 4%. It depends on the soy, variety, but that can be also get out. That's not a big problem. If you use the phytase enzyme, phytic acid can be dissolved and it's good to go. So what is the other problems? There are non-starch polysaccharide and oligosaccharide, which constitute almost 30% on an average in soybean meal. That is a problem for especially for carnivore animal in aquaculture. Okay, so you can get all those information from recently. One of my book has been published by elsewhere. That is title of the book is Enzymes in Human Animal Nutrition. That book covers almost all kind of enzymes which had been used in food and feed. It depends on the human food, terrestrial animals, and aquatic animals. That covers all kind of enzymes which can improve the nutritional value of oilseed cake. There are some 2 major review papers I published a couple of years ago. One on the phytase enzyme application in fish nutrition, and the non-starch polysaccharides in fish nutrition. These are 2 big review papers. Also give you the overview of the anti-nutritional factor in oilseed cake, and also how can you get rid of all those anti-nutritional factor. What are the approaches you need to take care of it. So anyway, come to the point to the soybean meal. So as I mentioned, it has oligosaccharides. How can you get rid of oligosaccharides? Yes, we did. We developed some processing method with the support of Ohio Soybean Council that is called InjoMeal, and we are able to get rid of 100% oligosaccharide. Then it's good to go for the market, or aquatic animals can use as a protein source. So before we go to much detail, first we need to look at the basic, nutritional value of soybean meal. So I had a support from USAC, and they provided some fund to look at the nutritional quality of 2 types of soy, which coming from Brazil and US, and we'll look at. And what we found interesting is that Brazilian soybean has the higher protein. It's around 4 to 5% higher protein compared to the US soybean meal. However, the interesting thing here, what we found is that trypsin inhibitor is way higher in Brazilian soybean meal. We don't know why, but I believe it's because of the processing method. Their processing method may not be up to the mark. That could have left over some of the trypsin inhibitor. Otherwise, it should be lower. And then raffinose, oligosaccharides, 2 major oligosaccharide, raffinose and stacylose. It depends. Raffinose was higher in Brazilian soybean meal compared to the US soybean meal. However, stacylose was almost similar for both groups. Then we did the in vivo digestibility for both soybean, and we did not find any changes across the border. It doesn't matter you use the US soybean meal or Brazilian, we didn't find any major changes. Then we followed after the in vivo digestibility. We did some growth study and we see no changes. However, numerically, we saw better feed efficiency and growth in US soybean, but not significantly. Followed by, prior to coming to University of Idaho, I was at Kentucky State University. I had a support from Kentucky Soybean Board, what I did there is I used two commercial species, hybrid catfish and largemouth bass. And what we try to do is we compare four types of soybean meal in their diet. Interestingly, what we found is that conventional soybean meal performing better for both species compared to the other species. So which was interesting. We could not able to follow up those study, but that was kind of interesting things we found. And we don't know the reason. Maybe it could be the short-term feeding trial. The experiment was done only for 10 to 12 weeks, but we found that conventional soybean meal was way better than others. The enzymatically treated soybean meal was not so great for largemouth bass, because largemouth bass is tricky animal. They don't like much carbohydrate. They don't like any kind of oligosaccharides as well, or maybe free peptides. That could be reason that largemouth bass didn't like the enzymatically treated soybean meal. So what is the problem using soybean meal in aquatic animals? The major problems what we found is that if you have higher inclusion level of soybean meal in the aquatic animal diets, especially with the salmonids, they cause enteritis. Enteritis in layman word, it's called gut inflammation. So if you have more soybean meal in salmonids, let's say salmonids diet, there is a chance for gut inflammation. That is called enteritis. So what can you do about it? So if you have gut inflammation, ultimately fish will not grow as good as you are expecting. So what can you do about it? So there are two major approaches. First, you can do the processing and nutritional approaches. What are those processing approaches? Either you can use chemicals, or you can and you can use the enzymes. One of my PhD student, Marina Rubio, she's working on nutritional approaches to mitigate the enteritis, so we can use as much as soybean meal we can put into the salmonids, especially with the rainbow trout. So we are using two major nutritional approaches. First is that is called functional feed additives, glutamine and bile acid. So that is the nutritional approach. Then my another PhD student, Kimia Kajwab, she's already done with her PhD work. What she did is that we have a selected trout lines in our research center, which has been created by USDA and University of Idaho. Ken Opertov will take care of it. He will discuss more about it. So what she did, Kimia Kajwab, is that she selected some of the trout lines which can utilize high soybean meal diet and also has the better feed efficiency. So that was the two approaches. As I mentioned earlier, that we developed some of the Injo meal, that is the enzymatically treated soybean meal, how good compared to the traditional soybean meal. So this was supported by the Ohio Soybean Council. So I just want to go the summary of this Injo meal. The protein content is 22% higher, and the carbohydrate decreases, especially all non-starch polysaccharide decreases more than 50%. And then oligosaccharide, we are able to get rid of 100%. So there was no oligosaccharide in Injo meal. Then what we did is that we tested with different animals such as yellow perch, rainbow trout, shrimp, largemouth bass, and Atlantic salmon and tilapia. The summary is Injo meal can replace 100% fish meal in shrimp and 50% fish meal in finfish. That's the summary of Injo meal. So if I can also show you in a pictorial view, or you can see here clearly that the fish meal intestine, the intestine of the trout, you could see the fish meal fed group intestine is well developed. There is no problem with the villi. However, the soybean meal, you could see here there is a gut inflammation. It's called enteritis. However, when we fed the Injo meal, you could see they are way better than soybean meal. So that means Injo meal is way better. The last word.
Yeah, I just want to make sure keeping us on time. That's my job. I have to be bad cop here.
Three more slides, then we are done.
Take it home. Okay.
Okay, great. So another work which we did recently is that we had support from Ohio Soybean Council. So we did research on adding glutamine in a soybean meal-based diet to mitigate the enteritis. So we had the three major diets: fish meal diet, soybean meal diet. So we used almost 30% soybean meal in trout, which is good, which is a bit higher. And then we added third diet, we added glutamine. And we try to start from when they are baby till the food side. And you could see here that at the end, the fish were almost like 500 grams. And at the end, what we found is that adding glutamine mitigate the enteritis, and also it's improved the growth compared to the soybean meal fed group. That was the summary. And then I want to go to the point. So my another PhD student, what she tried to do is that we have a selected trout lines here that is called vegetarian trout, which eats only soybean meal based diet. So what we did is that we tried to select some of the trout lines which has the better feed efficiency. What do you mean by the better feed efficiency? For example, you have trout A and trout B. So trout A, when they eat 5 pellets, for example, or 6 pellets, and they eat 14 pellets, and at the end, they grow same size. So which trout will you choose? So for sure, we'll choose trout A. And that work was supported by the Soy Aquaculture Alliance. We were able to select the trout lines, and you could see here their feed conversion ratio. One of our families or one of our group in the selecting process, you could see their FCR is 0.99, which is less than 1, but rest of the other trouts had FCR more than 1, 1.26, 1.41, 1.40. So that 0.99 FCR we selected, and that could be used for the next generation for the commercial. So that's the overview, and the outcome of this project was that we are able to improve the feed efficiency by 10 to 20%, and that reduce the cost of production. Hopefully that will be sustainable aquaculture production. All right, so I would like to thank each one of the funding agency and then collaborator, especially the Dr. Overtop. He's one of the collaborators from USDA. And for sure, at the end, my lab, without their support, it's not possible. Thank you.
Yeah, Vikas, that's fascinating work. I know Kenlin, myself, and you were talking about this exact research earlier this week. So we look forward to getting that published and being able to share with the group. And we will also share your slides.
Sure.
Very interesting. I have a couple questions coming in, so stay tuned. But I do want to move to our third and final speaker on our research panel, Ken Overturf with the United States Department of Agriculture's Agriculture Research Service. So Ken, feel free to share.
Okay. So what do I have, like 2 minutes?
Nope, you're fine. You are just fine.
No, Ken, I think I covered yours.
Thank you. Okay, so are you seeing it now?
You got it.
All right, good. So, all right. So, with USDA, I'm with the Agricultural Research Service, and specifically our project is increasing aquaculture production, looking at better feeds, better fish, and better management practices, because it all comes together in order to improve utilization and growth. And within our group, there's myself, a geneticist. We have Tom Welker, a physiologist, Keishan Liu, a cereal chemist, and our nutritionist is Wendy Seeley. And we work closely with feed manufacturers and producers to increase sustainable aquaculture production. So we develop diets formulated with sustainable material. We genetically select fish to utilize these diets, and we evaluate them under production conditions, testing the feeds in the animals for growth, health, and the effect on water quality and those interactions. So there's a lot of moving parts going on in some of these studies, but what I'm going to talk to you today is about some research we've been doing for selection, and it's been going on for quite some time, and some of this was supported by USAC and the U.S. Soybean Group. But specifically, when we're doing our studies, what we're evaluating in the long term is, again, the fish, multiple different strains, how they utilize feeds, how they grow under certain conditions. The feed, obviously, we were able to produce commercial grade, experimental size feeds that we can study, and we've tested a lot of different formulations. And again, the effect of the feed on the fish and in the water. This is going to be very important, especially when you're looking at RAS systems where it's recirculated, or cereal systems where it's cereal passage, and they see a lot of it. And we see coming down the road, there's going to be a lot more probably regulations evaluating what is coming out of fish farms. This is going to be really important. but also we want to look up the microbial makeup, and that is made up due to the feed and the individuals. And the microbes, the microbiome, as we're looking at here, is there's been a lot of research done, there's been a lot of reporting in the news about it. It's important because it's almost another organ that makes up, and it's involved in nutrient utilization, and it's involved in the immunological aspects of the animal. So we're really interested in evaluating that and how it changes according to strain and diet. So, and the studies we've done, so we've been selecting fish to utilize a plant-based diet. Specifically, soybean meal has been the major protein source, or a major protein source of the diet. And we started at 15% soybean meal, and we've done 11 generations now, and we've increased the stringency out to where we're at 25% soybean meal, and we've been able to increase the growth from 175 grams over 400 grams during the same time period. And then comparing these fish to either conservation or non-selected commercial strains, we're able to show better growth on the plant-based diet and improved protein efficiency. And the protein retention efficiency is really interesting because, so we're selecting on the utilization of this, and it's physiologically changing the animals. And some of those we're seeing is enhanced amino acid transportation across the intestinal borders. It's just kind of shown here, our commercial versus our selected, where we see a homogeneous decrease of amino acids in the plasma of the fish over time, unlike commercial strains. We've also shown that this is related to changes in pH in the intestine, which also corresponds to changes in amino acid transporters, which is involved in transporting nutrients across those intestinal borders. Now, like Vikas had mentioned, one of the real issues of using soybean meal is the development of enteritis, or intestinal inflammation. And looking at our fish, selected versus non-selected here on the top, we've got histology, and on the bottom left-hand corner, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, basically we have a non-selected fish on a fish meal diet, so that's a normal healthy microvilli. And it's the same with our selected fish on fish meal. However, when you go to non-selected on the plant meal, you see the development of enteritis with the inflammation of immunological cells and increased width of propionlamina, etc. While in our selected fish, you see perfectly healthy normal microvilli. And evaluating that further, using PCNA staining, we see that the non-selected fish on the plant meal diet has increased turnover throughout the microvilli, which is not good. And it's much reduced in our selected fish on plant-based. And looking at staining for fatty acid binding protein, which is a carrier of lipids across the membrane, so getting nutrients in, we see that there's decreased staining, so there's reduced capacity to transport these energy sources across the intestinal membrane in non-selected fish on these plant meal-based diets. Well, it's not affected in our selected fish. So even carrying that out a little bit further, we're able to use that not only select for just plant protein, we do a complete plant protein, plant lipid selection. And we were able to validate assays and look at the levels of EPA and DHA, which are the heart and brain healthy fatty acids that commercial buyers are interested in, obviously, when they eat fish. And we were able to improve this trait 14% on an all-plant lipid. So we're able to improve the ability to biosynthesize and convert plant lipids to EPA and DHA and store that in the muscle. And then utilizing these fish through transcriptomics and proteomic analysis, we're able to delineate the regulation for this trait. So that's helpful moving on. Now, as far as these fish, they've been well accepted by the industry. Some of the largest growers in the US are utilizing our stocks, or their germplasm are in their broodstock strains. And so it's been published, and we've gotten quite a bit of press on it also. But moving on, all right, when you look at commercial production and you talk to growers, what they always are focused on are diets, the two main costs, diets and disease, all right? What was interesting, so we're selecting fish to utilize this plant-based diet, all right? We know that they don't develop enteritis, so we know there's been modulations in the immune system of these fish. So we've also evaluated them for other things, such as the protein retention efficiency, but we also look at disease resistance because it was available to us originally, and we've expanded since then. What we've noticed in these fish that have been selected, not for disease resistance, but for dietary utilization, is they have an enhanced non-specific pathogen resistance and versus non-selected commercial strains. And shown here are the major bacterial and virus pathogens that affect fish. I've shown here, they have a higher resistance than that. And we've also shown that translates to other aspects of the immune system, looking at lysozyme levels for Flagobacterium and IHN. And then also when we're looking at just the expression of immune and stress genes at fish at 3 and 7 months, so pre and post enteritis development in these fish on plant-based diets. Looking at selected versus non-selected, either on a fish meal or plant-based diet, we see that there's been basically changes in their immune system for both innate and adaptive immune systems. So what is going on? I mean, selection for the utilization of soybean diet has increased the disease resistance in these. How can we translate that to other species or to the increased utilization of soy? Well, some of the work by my postdoc, Jake Bledsoe, which has been really exciting because we've been generating these huge data sets, looking at proteomics, transcriptomics, microbiome, etc. And now we're correlating that data together. So here on the top, we see basically selected and non-selected fish changes in the transcriptome according to if they're infected or not. All right, here there's no difference between the strains. Once they're infected with pathogen, we see related differences, and we see a correlated change in the microbiome relative to the transcriptome for the strains, whether it's infected or non-infected. So we've got these differences that come into play. Part of that microbiome we've already reported, and we know that selected fish, either on the plant meal or fish meal based diet, show the microbiome stays relatively the same. While non-selected fish, when they're on a fish meal based diet, looks like the selected strain. But when it goes to a plant based diet, the microbiome changes. So this is related to the transcriptome, and we believe that non-specific pathogen resistance, which is something really interesting that if we can translate to the specific mechanisms and move that to other species, would really drive utilization of that diet. But there are issues, and Tom Welker and Wendy, they're looking at a lot of this. Part of the issues of using soybean meal diets, whether it's soybean meal or soy protein concentrate, is we show that when it's in there, we see increased levels of fines, which are not good because it reduces water quality significantly. And like I said before, in a RAS system, that's real issues, especially in your filters. If you're in cereal reuse, you're downstream receiving fish. Basically it blocks gill uptake. You have an enhanced levels of pathogen growth, etc. And we feel that's probably going to be monitored even further, in looking at net pens. So this is an issue that we're working on right now in what additives can we use to reduce the levels of these fines and get larger particles that are easier to filter or clean out. And that's an issue that's coming down the road. Is probably going to be something big that's going to need to be looked at. So hopefully I'm trying to keep in time. In summary for that, all right, soybean meal is currently the largest protein component in aquaculture feeds. So as aquaculture grows, obviously more soybean meal or soy protein is going to be utilized. So with new regions and new species, proper nutritional and functional studies will lead to greater amounts of soybeans required. All right, studies in our selected line, when compared to other strains, have demonstrated improved tolerance to the anti-nutritional factors due to physical modifications in the fish, leading to changes in intestinal morphology, nutrient partitioning, immunological response, and microbiome colonization. And that plays a big role in utilizing in pathogen resistance, utilizing the feed, etc. The physiological mechanisms of soy utilization related to improved protein utilization and non-specific pathogen resistance are important, and that transfer to other species is going to be a real driver in the future. But one thing we do have to take into account is the reducing the harmful impacts related to utilization of soy diets. And it's imperative for its continued utilization and higher incorporation in aquaculture feeds. So hopefully that's right about 10 minutes, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, you did great. That was very informative, Ken. So if we can have our three panelists, Paul, Vikas, and Ken, come back on video. We do have a couple questions that have been coming in. The first I want to parlay off of something that really was a focus of Paul's presentation, and I know is a big discussion in the industry, you know, for the future, the current and future use of soybeans and its value. You know, does it make more sense to focus on omnivorous species or carnivorous species? And how do we prioritize those, realizing there's so many species out there, specifically when it comes to opportunities for US soy? Who wants to take that one first?
I will, if I can unmute myself. Here we go. That's a good philosophical question, and it's one that's been raised and discussed in aquaculture for a long time. Which species should we be feeding? Should we be feeding those that are low on the food chain that can utilize high levels of soy, or should we stick with market demand and the popular fishes, carnivorous fishes, the sport fishes, and things like that? And that's the question for the industry to answer for us and then guide us. If you want to approach it from a very cold perspective, we should probably be feeding those species that feed low on the food chain. And those that could utilize high protein or high soy inclusion levels. But we have to go with what the industry wants to grow. And right now we're still seeing that they want to grow carnivorous species. And that's where it gets to be a bit more problematic with soy inclusion rates.
Interesting. Vikas, do you have a take on that? You're on mute. There you go.
Okay. If you don't mind, can you repeat the question, or can you put this question on the screen or something?
Oh, yeah. I'll repeat it. So with so many species in the aquaculture industry and omnivorous versus carnivorous, how should the industry go about prioritizing research and how we target the species where we have the biggest opportunities?
Oh, thank you. It's a good question, actually. For sure, like, you know, the fact is fact. Fact will be always the same. So right now, aquaculture industry is focusing on carnivore animals. You know, salmon, trout, salmonids are the kind of leading industry. So we can change so easily. We can just move from salmon to some other species. It takes time. However, in omnivore animals, we can add much soybean meal compared to the salmonids or carnivore animal. But there is, even in carnivore animal, we can add much, but we have to take care some of the different approaches, like genetic approaches or maybe additive approaches. Right now, we are looking some of the functional feed additive approaches that could help some of the carnivore animal can take more soy in their diet. That will be like practically easily available. You know, genetic process would takes time. Like, for example, Ken and Dr. Hardy, these guys, they did it. It took like, how many years, Ken? 18 years. So it takes time to get that things done. But I would say that feed formulation is one of the approaches, by adding functional feed additives or play with the different ingredients that could help them. So there are, in terms of feed additives, you can use the natural feed ingredients. You don't have to buy from outside sometime. You can use different ingredients that can supply those additives. You know, that could be one approach, is to tackle the soybean in salmonids, but omnivore is okay. They can take up to 40% soybean, no problem. So that's fine.
Gotcha. And Ken, any additional thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, my thoughts are economics is always going to drive the market. So basically, they're only going to raise fish that they're going to be able to sell. And the higher valued fish, obviously, you're going to make more money on a smaller footprint. All right. So what comes down to that is what's out there, what level of domestication, because first thing, when you bring in, if there's a new species, it has to be domesticated. You have to formulate the diets for it. All right. But it's going to be there. These higher value species are typically all carnivorous, and that's what's going to be a driving force still in the future. Manipulating those fish so that they can utilize more soy, or nutritionally formulating diets better so that they can utilize more, is going to be very important. Hopefully, again, it took us a while doing the genetic selection we did, but what we've learned hopefully can be applied to reduce that selection time much less in future species.
Yeah, that's a good point. Moving on to another question, actually specifically for Ken. It was asked, how are selected lines genetically different from non-selected lines of fish?
Basically, if you're talking physiologically, if you're talking, genetically, they genotype differently. They've been selected specifically and maintained on that basis. What we have shown, like I briefly mentioned on that, so these fish do not develop enteritis, all right, when they're on a similar soybean diet over the time. So there's been some physiological changes in the intestine, and such that they can utilize it and they don't have that inflammation develop. Further evaluation of that, like I mentioned on that, is we've shown that they can uptake and transport, they have a better synchronous uptake and transport of amino acids, such that their metabolism becomes more efficient because the nutrients are available all at the same time. While we show for other strains, they do their metabolic processes, and because it's not so synchronous, they have to go back into other organs and break them down for amino acids to complete metabolic processes. Again, we've shown that the pH in that, immunologically, we've shown the differences. Other than that, there's probably other things too that we haven't even addressed yet, but we're still using them as a model to evaluate dietary efficiency and nutrient uptake and utilization.
Excellent. No, that's some good things to think about. Last question for this panel was a result of VICA, something that you spoke to. And I know the industry here in the US is always seeking continuous improvement. And one thing that's been identified, specific US versus Brazil, is the processing of soybean meal. So when we think about U.S. processing of our soybean meal, how impactful or difficult do we think those changes could be for feed manufacturers to get to the next step? What is the next step of improvement in this space, or do we know yet?
So we did some basic preliminary work. So it's very hard to make comments on it, but what I believe is their processing kind of approaches is a bit like maybe old-fashioned, or maybe they are not up to the mark. Because what I saw is that some of the, let's say, lectin, we did just the trypsin inhibitor, but we couldn't do all the kind of anti-nutritional factors. If that is the case, we can't use much soybean meal in the salmonids feed, because oligosaccharides, all those anti-nutritional factors, salmonids or carnivore animals are very sensitive to that anti-nutritional factor. However, the other omnivore or herbivore animal, they are okay with that. But salmonids feed, we have to be very careful. We need to make sure they are processed properly. They are, get rid of all those kind of anti-nutritional factor as much we can. So in terms of processing, we have to kind of upgrade those things.
Interesting. Ken or Paul, do you have any other additional thoughts on just processing impact to quality of U.S. soy?
No, I don't. And that brings in the whole interaction back with the soy crushing industry, which has always been kind of a fascinating component that we don't consider a lot when we consider always feeding animals. And I don't know where they stand these days, but clearly there are some groups that have dedicated and specialty genetics, Sillinger, Owenborough grain, people like that. You've got Hamlet protein in Denmark. You've got some specialty products that are trying to target aquaculture specifically. Then it gets to be a question, of supply and pricing. And do you have enough to really supply any of the major aquaculture industries? So that demand volume curve is also absolutely critical. For example, we can use fairly high levels of soybean meal in diets for hybrid striped bass, and yet there's not enough hybrid striped bass culture yet to really justify an individual feed mill dedicating a line and steady supply of a specialty diet that meets just the needs of the hybrid striped bass. So you've got some real complicated issues on the business side of things once you go out of the laboratory and out to practical aquaculture.
Kenny, any additional thoughts?
No, not much. I mean, Paul addressed that really well. Infrastructure has always been an issue, and we've dealt with a number of these specialty groups making special soybeans. But the idea is you have to have enough demand such that you've got a volume that you've got a plant that can either shut down and run that separate, or you've got to have your own plant for it, because the volume that they run when they do processing really makes it, they don't want to shut that down for small scale processing of specialty products unless there's a huge demand for that or the price dictates it.
Yep, completely fair. And that will tee up our next panel. We'll to hear from our nutritionist. But before I let you all go, another question, are there, or what are some ingredients that could be complementary to utilizing soybean meal in carnivorous fish that might improve its absorption, which you've identified as a challenge?
I can take this one, Courtney. Yes, we have been working on complementary feed ingredients, and yes, it's a good question. So that's the kind of future for feed formulation. There is a limitation for some of the ingredients. For example, soybean for carnivore animals, we can't go more than 30%, for example. So if you want to go 35, what can you do about it? So you have to add some other ingredients which can complement, can help them to absorb that, soybean meal, for example. So recently we did one research project with soybean versus insect protein. So insect protein acts as a complementary ingredients for our work that helps or that mitigated the enteritis, which was caused by the soybean. So that is one of the examples. Then we also work on something, and there are some other study has been done on non-essential amino acid, which can come from the bacterial protein. So if you have the bacterial protein, which is already available commercially, so you need to play with the feed formulation. So if you add some amount of bacterial protein in the diet, and that provides some non-essential amino acids such as glutamine, okay? If glutamine, you have enough glutamine, that is non-essential amino acid, people ignore non-essential amino acid, but that's the future for aquaculture now, because you can't ignore non-essential amino acid. That's very important. I did during my PhD some work. I also ignored it. I thought, oh, it's okay. We just balance essential amino acid for the diet, protein, lipid, done. But you can't ignore much. We have to take care. So that's why I put one of my PhD students, actually two of my PhD students, to work on non-essential amino acid. Why, how it is important, and how can we tackle the feed formulation. So for example, glutamine is one of the non-essential amino acid that can be present in bacterial protein. And as you saw one of my slide, that if you have glutamine at certain level, that can mitigate the enteritis, which is caused by the soybean. So that means that opens the door or complement like bacterial protein or other any ingredient, let's say yeast or something, that can give you glutamine. You are more than welcome to add more, but take care of the cost, but you can use more other ingredients, especially for carnivore animals, even for omnivore animals as well.
Thank you. Ken or Paul, any additional comments to build off of what Vikas just provided?
Yeah, the next step in our work was taking those maximum levels of soybean meal incorporation in these new and emerging species and finding complementary proteins just to meet the essential amino acid needs. And what we found basically was that soy with almost any of the animal byproduct meals met the essential amino acid needs and resulted in growth that was within 95 to 100% of the growth we see in a fish meal based diet. So in terms of formulation strategy, the fish meal free option is out there. But again, it gets into a question of supply and demand.
And anything to round that out?
No, the nutritionists handled that quite well. I mean, the only thing that I want to mention is a lot of these studies, they've gotten a lot better now where they're doing longer term studies. But a lot of the studies initially that were done when people were substituting were short-term studies. And while they showed good growth and good health in the animals, then we found out that a long-term or under production conditions, it wasn't quite nor near as well what we saw in the lab.
And then to follow up with that, there's also an awful lot of the alternative protein source evaluations that have been on just a nitrogen basis, not on the basis of essential amino acid needs. So we started trying to predict those, and there's methods now we can predict those given some basic chemical measurements. So it again, for those of you who are perhaps poultry or swine nutritionists and things like that, feed mills trying to consider this stuff, you've got quite a bit of variability from a simple nitrogen isonitrogenous comparison over to an amino acid basis. So again, Ken's certainly right. Short-term trials versus long-term trials. You've got nitrogen versus amino acid approaches. So it gets a bit complicated to sift through some of this stuff sometimes.
Courtney, can I add something?
You bet.
Sure. So in terms of this complementing the ingredients to each other, so as Paul mentioned that, you can have different alternative ingredients such as poultry meal, blood meal, plant ingredients, and then you balance the essential amino acid and so on, right? In addition to that, we need to also consider the digestibility. If you balance each amino acid or protein, lipid in the diet, and two diets, you have exactly the same amino acids content, protein content, lipid content. One of them are not digestible enough. So you have to consider the digestible protein or digestible amino acids, digestible lipid or digestible fatty acid when you make it. If it's not enough digestible, even you are complementing with other ingredients, it's not going to work. So recently, Dr. Brett Glencross from University of Stirling, he moved to IFCO. He has written a very, very nice review paper, especially for the young researcher and the industry, how to formulate the diet, what you need to reconsider. In the past, we used to replace the fish meal, or we used to complement ingredients, we balance everything, good to go. And 8 weeks trial, 9 weeks trial, 10 weeks trial, we found something and then we conclude it. That's why he made a very strong statement in that review paper. What do you have to consider before you go for the industry work? So that was a good review paper from Dr. Glencross. It's balancing digestible protein and lipid for sustainable aquafeed industry.
Excellent. Well, that was a great, some good thoughts to end on. As the Soy Aquaculture Alliance has reiterated many times, the work and the relationship between basic and applied research is critical to current and future aquaculture industry advancement. So thank you guys for your very deep insights, and we will follow up at the end with some questions. Keep them coming in the Q&A if so. We're going to move on to our second panel, and our second panel is focusing on our nutritionists, which were mentioned multiple times in the previous speakers' comments. You guys are very important components to taking the right approach today and tomorrow for aquaculture in the United States. So I'll introduce our panelists. We have two. First will be Jason Mann. He's the Director of Nutrition at Riverence. And then we have Sergio Nates, who's the Executive Vice President at Prairie Aquatech. So Jason, I'll turn it over to you to share your initial thoughts.
Good morning, good afternoon, evening to everyone. Thanks a lot for joining. Can you hear me okay, Courtney?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So I'll share the screen here.
There you go.
Okay, well, thanks a lot everyone for joining, and I really appreciate people listening in, and it's a very very informative session on the R&D. I think a lot of it's over my head. It's the old school days, but it's a nice refresher. And I think it's gotten very technical. But we need to move into these details to really understand soybean and the interactions that soybean has. I'm an industrial commercial fish nutritionist, and I've been doing this for about 35 years, largely in the salmon field, but also marine species. And I'm really keen to share some of my experiences with you all. And I'll try to give a bit of an overview initially on nutrition, and then focus on soybean toward the last slides. So just bear with me. Some things just to keep in mind, and I think this is a bit of in the back of our mind. The U.S. imports most of its seafood, and feed is our largest operating cost on the farms. And I talk about Riverence or any farm. It's about 60% of the operating cost. Feed companies are really trying to use co-products or byproducts these days. In the food world, or more than a third of our food goes uneaten. So this is another area that's potential for making raw materials for aqua feeds as well. Water clarity and clean water is very precious, so we need to conserve that in doing good aquaculture done right. Sustainability is a goal for all of us. The US has a lot of ingredients, so we really don't need to leave the continent. We can source locally, and we should be. And that's been a focal point of mine personally, and partners that we're working with in Rangan Feeds and Skrading, both feed companies that are local. Consumers want local food, and we really see more of this in the pandemic year and a quarter. But we need to tell our stories in a better way and proactively, because people don't really know where their food comes from. I'm working for the company Riverence, and it's based in southern Idaho, where Ken Overturf and Bikaz are in the same region, and it's the Hagerman Valley, which is really I would say blessed area for raising trout. Natural spring water is coming out, and it's ideal temperature, so it's almost like a nature's RAS, or a recirculation system. So this location has more than half of the American trout production in this 38-mile stretch of the Snake River Canyon. And this is one of our farms based along the Snake River Canyon. And this is land-based raceways. And so it's not RAS, but it's flow-through systems. And in Washington State, we have a modern RAS system where we have our broodstock and egg production. And this is a sign of future production is going to be more and more in this direction, RAS. But it's still a young technology, lots of headwinds, learning. So some of the basic things we really want to understand, what species we're feeding here. I think Paul mentioned this, and VCAS as well. We need to know the requirements, and often the literature has a lot of information there. If not, we need to look at nature and what do these animals eat, and then conduct practical R&D. Then we need to know will the fish be raised extensively or intensively, and what are the end markets for the farmed fish or crustaceans. And in our case, indigenous rainbow trout strains are what Riverence is using. It's one example. It's not ingredients that we're really after. What we really need to do as nutritionists is we need to balance for nutrients. What nutrients does the fish we're targeting need? So we're balancing for nutrients, and the ingredients happen to be the carriers of these nutrients. We need to do it in a balanced way. So it's always important to keep that in mind, because consumers get caught up in this, that they always think, well, we don't want to use that ingredient in our fish, but it's the nutrients that comprise the ingredient. Paul really went into good detail here, and just coincidentally, and we didn't compare notes, but really we're saying the same thing here, that different species have different protein and lipid requirements. And this is really a high level view, protein and fat. It's a way of looking at it generally, but amino acids, fatty acids, etc. get into the details. But I would say the catfish, carp, tilapia, shrimp have more room in these diets for using traditional soybean meal. And then the trout, salmon, and marine species that have higher protein, higher lipid, denser diets, they need high protein soy products like SPC or isolate or something like that. So it's not that folks don't want to use soybean meal, just there isn't practical space. But in addition, some of the other points that were raised in the R&D section. We need to know about our ingredients, what's available to us as nutritionists. Localization is the trend. We don't want a long supply chain. And what nutrients does each ingredient contribute? And what's the availability, as Vikas mentioned, about digestibility, availability? You know, always having a variety of potential raw materials is important for an industrial, practical nutritionist and in a feed company or a fish farming company. You know, you can balance diets better, but also availability, supply, all of the above. There's many, you always want to have more choices to begin with. This is an important slide that's I've adapted a little bit. It's from TechCon in 2008, but the inclusion rate of fish meal is actually, it's gotten lower than folks often think. I mean, we started in the high level, like 40, 50, 60% for the marine species or the salmon and trout. And all of these species have tapered down to, you know, you're in that kind of 10 to 15% range. So industrially, the inclusion rate of fish meal is low. And I don't think it's so much that we need to talk about replacing fish meal anymore. It's a matter of creating space amongst the alternative ingredients that we need to be thinking when we're talking about even soy products. As mentioned earlier, Ken described this, but environment in which the fish are to be fed, the impact on the environment is critical. You know, the benthic environment in sea cages, water leaving raceways, and the regulations which are ever tightening. So we need to be cognizant of that. In a recipe, we set the parameters, the minimum, maximum levels for nutrients, for raw materials where needed, but more constraints generally means a higher feed recipe cost. And so we also have to include the price of each ingredient and then consider the pellet quality, how the feed is going to be used, pellet size, and the life stage of the animal. We also consider water stability of the feed, the floating or sinking, particle size, fineness, grind, and how low is the yield and fines in the feed and fecal. Again, Ken touched on this. So different soy products that practically, this is from my perspective, it's not universal perhaps, but I really try to look at this as different categories in the soy products for aqua feed potentially. And I have maybe a bit of a bias towards salmon and trout because that's a lot of my background, but still I'm trying to be big picture on this. Soybean meal, whether it's full fat, expeller or extracted, meaning that less fat as we go through the 3 steps there, soy protein concentrate, soybean oil, and then new novel niche soy products are different kind of categories. In the soybean meal class, which is the high volume area and traditional, domestically produced in large quantities, these are some of the advantages that I see. Visible prices, you can see prices every day, futures, etc. It's a mid protein level ingredient, 46, 47%. Again, full fat soy, 4 or 5% expeller, and then solvent extracted soybean, it's available. Good solutions for delivering it, and it's generally genetically modified, but also non-GM is available in the US. But the last one here, genetic lines that have potential to increase usage in diets. This is very interesting for me and for, I think, nutritionists to really open up some of these aspects in terms of protein levels in soybean meal can be higher with certain lines, and also the anti-nutritional factors can be moderated. Of concern, of course, in soybean meal has been described well in detail by the previous R&D team. The anti-nutritional factors are a concern. The amino acid profile is also, you have to supplement certain amino acids to balance. And then effect on the intestine at higher levels, which, you can tell I'm a layperson or industrial guy because I can't do what was mentioned very detailed in the beautiful slides that were presented earlier. Soy protein concentrate is I like this category a lot. And the Europeans or the salmon farming companies really have incorporated this over the last 15 years in a big way. And I don't think we really realize how popular of an ingredient this has gotten until now. We see some of the issues going on in Brazil where there's challenges with, the deforestation, etc., where now there's a bit more scramble to look for other sources or other ingredients that can replace the current soy protein that's used in these countries. Higher inclusion rates in the diets is possible. It's gentle on the fish stomach, highly digestible, low in anti-nutritional factors, a relatively good binder with extrusion. SPC is available in the US, but it's generally targeting the starter diets for piglets and other young. It's widely used in many fish farming countries. I found over the years that packaging in small bags is more common, and I think availability in bulk has been very difficult whenever I've tried to source this. Prices are, I would say, high versus other ingredients or imports. Soybean oil, it's again large production, visible prices, easy to deliver, rail, bulk, truck. But really, the omega-3 level is what we really want in our oily fish diets. And this is something that, the canola oil guys are working on by hybridizing or bringing in omega-3 levels higher. Soybean oil is a good energy source, but on the kind of negative side, the omega-6 level is quite high, and it's less desirable for aqua diets compared to some of the other choices. So its usage is limited more as an energy source rather than as a source of omega-3s. Now, this is kind of my favorite category in recent years, the novel soybean protein area and domestically produced products. And we have commercial examples of this that are actually operating. ME Pro, which is a this is really a enhanced protein that's in the 70s, really good product. And it's available. Benson Hill, which is a company, has the Sillinger genetics. Again, a very interesting and promising area for just regular soybean meal with high protein in the 50s as produced. So these are things that we're really looking forward to and wanting to see how they work in our aqua diets at higher inclusion rates, which is one of the goals, for all of us here. We want to rely less on imported SPC, which, surprisingly, it still comes into North America from Brazil and other places. In these categories that are specific, contract growing by soy farmers is needed, which is fine. Everybody knows where they are. The cost is higher per unit weight, but the value is also higher. So, once you're educated, it's I think a lot of potential here. Today, limited use in aquaculture due to it's a young sector, but I think Sergio is going to talk more about this, but I think it's really exciting, this kind of development. I mean, this is the kind of thing that we often wait for, but it's always hard to adopt these things too, because it's something new. People are leery, they don't want to be the first one, but I think this is an exciting area, and I think we should really look at this and compare and see how these are being, how they work in the diets at higher inclusion rates. And it's a domestic, novel source of really good protein. Some of the challenges that I see in soy, just to summarize a little bit, anti-nutritional factors and performance limit the use of soybean meal inclusion in practical diets for salmon and trout feeds and other species. We need a rapid way to measure for some of these anti-nutritional factors, for buyers or QC departments in a mill. Low protein soybean meal, it limits the use just because of the density of the diet types. Domestic production of SPC is moderate, smaller than I would like to see. Expeller or full fat soy are better because for aqua feeds, we need both protein and oil. So they contribute both. But again, availability is not that common. But this is an area that could be an interim step before SPC, that we could have these available more so. Soy oil is low in omega-3, so if there's any work on selection or hybrids we could do, that's an important point. traceability of soybean meal when you buy in rail cars, it's a little more challenging. So that's something to keep in mind, because the millennials and consumers today in aquaculture products, they want to know where did the ingredients come from. So more and more, this is getting to be an important point. Opportunities, I think the potential is enormous. The U.S. seafood market is large and growing. The average consumption in the U.S. is only 16 pounds per person per year of aquaculture products. In contrast, Japan and Korea, it's nearly 8-9 times that level. Okay, it's a different culture, but in Western Europe, people are eating triple the level that Americans eat of seafood. So, we don't have to try very hard. We can benchmark with the Western Europeans and say we could triple our market or the consumption. But here's some really key points. Less than 1/10 of the seafood consumed in the US is homegrown in American soil or water. And so the total salmon and trout consumed in the US in last year, it's around 900 million pounds. But the production for salmon and trout is only 80 million pounds. So what a gap. So really, we have a huge opportunity even with today's kind of import-export balance. And the aqua feed sector really wants to have more domestically produced soy products and choices under that category that enhance the fish performance, quality, and palatability and taste of the fish we're producing at the end is also very, very important for us. So with that, it's a little bit over time there, but I'd like to just end on that. And I think this is a product that's produced by Riverence in Idaho, and this contains a significant amount of soy products in our diets, but we would like to push that higher if we get the right kind of ingredients in the future. Thank you very much.
Jason, I really appreciate those thoughts. You identified a lot of what we call the SWOT analysis of the sector, and that fish looks delicious, just letting you know. So our next speaker is Sergio Nadas, who's the Executive Vice President of Prairie Aquatech. I really hope I pronounced your name correctly. If not, please correct me, but the screen is yours. Sergio, are you on the line?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
There you are.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out this. Jason put me on a bad spot after we had a discussion. I didn't know that I have to give a presentation, but I have a few slides here that I'm going to share. If I can figure out this.
That's just fine. We'll also take verbal comments as well. We're getting ample questions that you'll be able to respond to. So take it away.
Take it away. Let's see if I can. Sorry, I know that I should have been here before. I don't know if I can. Anyway, so I might have. Where's my Zoom here? Oh God, this always happens, huh? I don't know why I can't see my share screen. Is everyone still there?
Yes, we are still here.
Sorry, did I?
And if you'd like to just verbally provide your comments, you definitely can do that, and we can post your slides later if applicable, but feel free to just talk through it as well.
Sure. So I don't want to spend much time. I think Jason pretty much pointed out everything that all the opportunities that we have, not just on the usage of soybean meal, but probably also on what I call the soybean byproducts and co-products. As everyone probably knows in this group, I'm the Executive Vice President of Prairie Aquatech, and we focus basically on value-adding soybean meal co-products using proprietary fermentation technology. And there's three aspects of our technology, or at least when it comes down to ME Pro, that we focus on. One is our technology. So we trying to enhance the nutritional quality of this soybean meal co-product by producing ME Pro using the fermentation technology. So we try to remove all the anti-nutritional factors. We increase the protein, we concentrate the protein content of the soybean meal, and we make phosphorus much more available. The second aspect of it is sustainability, which I think Jason pointed out. And those of us who have the opportunity of dealing worldwide with ingredient utilization, we know that some of the large female operations in the world, especially the salmon producers, are looking very close to where that soy come from, the source of that soybean meal. We have these discussions about deforestation, land utilization, water utilization, et cetera, et cetera. And in that sense, I think that the U.S. soybean meal producers are very well positioned compared to, let's say, the Brazilians. And of course, the third one, which I believe is very important because, as Jason pointed out, we're facing two new generations. We're facing the X generation and the millennium generation. And one of the things that I always tell my colleagues is that these are very well-educated people that like to read labels. And when they read labels, they want to know the source of the ingredients, what are the ingredients that are being used in their foods that they're buying. And I always remind everyone that people buy a product of a product. So people don't buy soybean meal. They buy the fish and the shrimp that you find at the supermarkets. And they want to make sure that those animals are being fed ingredients with the characteristics that we have been discussing. So traceability becomes extremely important. It's very important for us. And one of the goals that we have is we created what's called the Certified Growing Network, in which we can trace back to some of the farmers, the soybean producers, where that soybean meal, where that soybeans come into the soybean meal factories. And then once that soybean meal enters our plant, how it's being processed. And we develop a QR code that allows us to pass that information to any feed producer, and of course down or up the supply chain, so people can trace back how any product is being produced. For someone who has been sitting on the board directors of the Global Aquaculture Alliance for a long time, and as a former chairman of the BIP, Fishmeal Certification Committee, probably 15 years ago, I discussed it with some of my colleagues that the certification programs will apply not only to the farms and to the hatcheries and to the field meal operations, but it will trickle down all the way to ingredients. And I believe that everyone in this panel already and all the assistants probably have noticed that that's the case now. So now everyone wants to make sure that the fish meal and the fish oil come from sustainable fisheries. Everyone wants to know that the soybean meal and probably all the other plant ingredients come from land that has not been deforested, has not gone through deforestation, etc. And most likely, I also spent some time with the renders of the animal byproducts. We always talk about traceability also in the rendering industry. That's probably everything that I can add to this presentation, and I'll be glad to take questions later on.
Thank you for those thoughts. Gave us some good things to think about. First question, because I'm going to move into a couple things that we're getting via Q&A. What research would support a decision to increase inclusion rates of soy in your diets? What don't you have as nutritionists, as key nutrition companies, that would help you make more educated and deliberative decisions to increase inclusion?
Maybe I can start on that. I think practically knowing that if there is variation from different sources of, let's say, soybean meal. So if you're buying a rail car from one company from a region of the US, it's fairly generic, where it's soybean meal 46, 47 protein. We don't know much more about it often. So knowing the strains or pre-testing of the anti-nutritional factors, has it been processed in an adequate way that we don't need to be concerned about that simple aspect of just anti-nutritional factors. Of course, the details of the oligosaccharides and all of that, it's just another layer of complexity over time. But we don't want to have anti-nutritional factors that are, that are coming to the feed mill and into the feed. So in effect, what we end up doing is almost limiting, for at least trout diets, how much soybean meal, conventional style, that we add, because we're afraid of that variation. And as described in the R&D slides, the effect on the villus, or the intestinal, the gut inflammation, enteritis, that has been, a lot of work has been done on that in Norway in the earlier years. So that's why they really decreased the usage of soybean meal and replaced it with SPC. SPC has few issues in relative to soybean meal for bumping up usage. So I think, if there's a preference, as an industrial nutritionist, I would gravitate towards SPC, because it has a number of these kind of built-in less negatives, if you will. It's maybe not fair, but I think soybean meal has a place in the more vegetarian type fish diets that Paul described. And I think those three categories that I kind of laid out with lower protein diets, lots of room there. But I think for the salmon and trout and marine species, we always end up putting a cap on how much we include of soybean meal. But not only formally as a cap, but there's not enough room. You can't formulate with 46 protein. It'll only take a certain percentage, and it won't meet the crude protein and total amino acids requirement. So a bit long-winded, but I think, having more traceable and information about the specific lots or rail cars or delivery points, as opposed to, from a different state, it could be different, or a different plant, it could be more variable. So these kind of more quick, fast, rapid method tests for ANFs would help give more confidence to at least raise the level where we can.
Yeah, those are some really good specific suggestions. I like that. Sergio, any additional thoughts on that?
Thank you, Kearney. I figured out how to get back into Zoom. I don't do this very often. I think that Jason is very right. There's also something that we always have to remember, is that over the years we have been dissecting what I call dissecting ingredients, and we have dissected very well soybean meal. So we have characterized soybean meal very well. But and we tend to just look into nutrient composition, but I think that we also beginning to see the functionality of ingredients. So now when we compare ingredients, we also look to the functionality of those ingredients. So we look to, issues, nutrients such as nucleotides and peptide composition. And that might drive also the use either of soybean meal or the competitors of soybean co-products. I think that the fact that we have to look beyond just amino acid and fatty acid composition of soybean meal might influence how much we use, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, those are some good thoughts. I want to circle back to the topic of SPC, or soy protein concentrate, which has come up a number of times already in this seminar. So question for you all, soy protein concentrate, especially here in the States, has high value potential. I know the research has probably just scratched the surface, but it's hard to find. So we see this likely as an opportunity for the Soy Aquaculture Alliance, and therein the U.S. Soybean Export Council. What information do we need to provide to the supply chain that might trigger more production?
Maybe I can just start on that. I think supply availability, basic information about the profile of the product, which generally it's fairly consistent, in the category. But pricing, I think that has been a challenge. I mean, it's priced, imports can get in here, including freight, and still be more, I would say, desirable from a cost point of view. But nobody wants to be having long supply chains. So that's why I raised this point that SPC has a place in aqua diets in all species. It's not just the salmon and trout and marine species, but if available, I think it could actually be included in all series, especially the younger stages of all the species where you need a higher protein and better digestible, less anti-nutritional. So I think the pricing and what that would look like is important. Folks, it has to be competitive with other ingredients that are in the mix. And there's profitability in it. It's not like it's not profitable, but there's efficiency if we increase production and supply. The plants are more efficient when they process and make it. And there's also bins and silos and a feed mill dedicated to it if it's available. But if it's in small bags or super sacks or 50-pound bags, that kind of already limits what you're going to do with it. You're going to be putting it into starter diets or not using it at all, because labor is an issue in a mill too. You want it in bulk. And I mean, basically mimicking, looking at what Europeans are doing. They're bringing SPC from Brazil for many, many years. How are they doing this? And it's not one supply source in Brazil, there's multiple. So they built a whole business on this export model. The US is a large producer of soy, and I think we've helped other countries develop soy protein concentrate or the technology. I think the market potential for aquaculture is large domestically, and I think we're seeing companies wanting to put RES aquaculture facilities in the US because the market's enormous for consumption of the fish. We have the ingredients in the raw form. Now we just need to transform it a little bit to the wish list, if you will, from industrial side. And I think, it's really supply, price, availability, and, having that assurance and delivered in bulk. I mean, that's my checklist. And I think if I speak for Skretting or any of the feed companies rang in, I think they would probably be nodding because we have some of these discussions sometimes.
Sergio, any additional comments on SPC supply?
Well, let's begin with the basics. The second largest trade deficit of the United States is seafood imports. So the US is not an aquaculture producer per se. And if there's no demand, then it becomes very difficult for companies to go through the investment. So I agree 150% with what Jason pointed out. As a matter of fact, the first note I put here was SPCs versus price. Ingredients are always benchmarking, one against the other one. So it might go back again to what I said previously, how you show, how you value add. An SPC is a value added co-product. And then you have to, the science is there. I'm not sure the markets are there. Currently we still are only, the US is the number 3rd or 4th producer of trout in the Western Hemisphere. You have Chile, Peru, Colombia ahead of us. So if there's no increase in aquaculture production and of course consumption, we still meat eaters. We eat a lot of beef and chicken compared to any fish. So we have to do the basics well, and then I think that the markets will come. I always say, build it, they will come.
I like that phrasing. So switching from supply of soy ingredients to more the production systems. I know the Soy Aquaculture Alliance does work with both of those. And you mentioned specifically, Jason, the RAS or the RAS system. And raising aquaculture, it continues to evolve. With the Alliance having invested in some research that the last panel mentioned to see how the technology we use for raising aquaculture interacts with soybean use. What have you all seen or questions that you continue to have with the intersection of production systems and ability to maximize aqua feeds with soy?
So I think as Ken Overturf mentioned earlier, and the idea of the waste and discharge. I mean, we often think of growth and feed conversions and fish health and all of these things. It's getting more complex, and I'd call it almost a miniature supply chain just around the fish. What comes out? I mean, we have to be thinking of the water is limited and getting more limited, fresh water. We need to use it wisely and reuse it. And after we've used it, place it back into the nature the same way we took it in. So fecal collection and that whole area, a lot of work is being done by, I would say, companies that are the Skretting and Biomar, and these companies are doing a lot of work on this. What happens to the fecal matter, and how is it caught? How is it captured? Is it a pellet going in, a pellet coming out? Can that pellet coming out be captured on a drum filter without suspending solids into the water? We don't want murky water. We want clean water. So about 180,000 tons of RAS production of salmon and trout has been announced in the US. Several announcements, and some are being built. It'll take time. It's not overnight. But that seafood deficit begs for solutions domestically. So a lot of investors from other countries are coming into the US investing in these plants, because it's not easy to get a license in the ocean, and cage farming it's steady state. It's not going to grow easily. I mean, it'll grow in some areas, but people are more in favor of land-based that is really not impacting the environment as much physically as they see it. How much energy it uses, et cetera, it's a different question. It's a lot of discussion, but RAS type of feeds will need to be, we need to one up on this. It's not just a matter of it's a good ingredient. It has to create good fecal matter that's easy to collect. And that's a whole technology area too. So I think particle size, grinding, how it sticks with other ingredients that are added to the feed. So I think this is a major area that we need to be looking at. And I think RAS, with Freshwater Institute, which is a research facility in Virginia, they do a lot of ideal work that is mimicking industry, and they recommend certain things to industry. I think we need to be thinking along these lines as one area, but there's others too. But I just, for the sake of time, I try to detail the fecal waste stream is important.
Yeah, everything that you just touched on, I see the synergies with what the U.S. industry and the Soy Aquaculture Alliance is doing on production systems, and what we at USEC are doing with systems, because as you're probably aware, we very much promote in-pond raceway systems in developed aqua markets. And that just allows so many variables, especially around water quality, the fecal aspect. You're spot on, and that's seen huge success. So it's not just one variable is what I'm hearing, which I think we all know, but it's good to reiterate. Sergio, additional thoughts?
Again, I think that Jason covers everything pretty well. We knew a long time ago at Prairie that we have to characterize the effects of not just the nutrient discharge, but also how the ingredient affects the physical properties of a pellet. And we have been looking into that. We, as everyone probably knows, we have our own RAS system. The flip side of that coin is, we always have to remember that it's all about the return on the investment. So all these companies that, as an example, we see the development of a lot of salmon RAS systems around the world. And, they're capital intense. So the question is, how they're going to become efficient. And on the other hand, in the US, you have very stringent EPA regulations. And, I was fortunate enough to work for the US government for some time and work for EPA. So I know that is very dynamic. Jason pretty much covered it all. I think nutrient discharge is extremely important when it comes down to RAS system, filtration system, designs, et cetera, et cetera.
So one final question, which I think ties everything together nicely from what we heard from the first panel and from your content, is, specifically the industry, whether it's the Soy Aquaculture Alliance and same with USEC, we've invested quite a bit in small scale research trials, but we need to obviously be able to apply those in commercial situations to bring real change to fruition in the aquaculture industry. So would love your opinions on how we can better provide these outcomes or takeaways to commercial aquaculture operations.
I think from my perspective, I think being aware firstly of what is the left hand doing and the right hand doing, and having these forums like this is very important to bring, raise questions, provide information, and then provide updates. So to industrial or companies that are making feed, their nutritionists really need to be crossing over with the soy associations like this. And I think that way they're brought up, maybe they're not aware of certain things. Information, once it is published on research that's been funded, that has to cross-pollinate with industry. And I think somehow we need to make sure that that is happening, and maybe seek feedback or through the different trade shows once they start back up. I mean, one-page handouts, or I think dealing with the nutritionist, and there's not a lot of companies making aquaculture feed in the US, but I think even personal connection with the association from the soy side and having that dialogue and saying, you know, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to bring you up to speed on new findings that we have. And I think that'll go a long way, because it's not, people are overwhelmed with information in all aspects of the supply chain. But if you just make it a more of a relationship thing where you update with the findings, and because a lot of times people aren't aware that it's happening, or they have an old bias that is there. So I think that relationship, even one-on-one, with maybe there's 12 or 15 or 20 phone calls, but it's worth it. And I think findings from this research in soy category, scanning the whole kind of publication element in literature, and even having abstracts of that and updating people, it'll give soy a lot more attention. And I think you know, it's not the only ingredient that's going to be used in the feed, but it'll make sure it's always there. It's up to date with new information. You're spending a lot of money on R&D, and jointly work's being done with the different ARS, USDA, the universities. But we need to make sure the paragraph or the concentrated findings are delivered to the ears of the industrial nutritionists who can consider it. And I think with folks like Sergio here telling about their product and their development and knowing where they are, what they do, I think we need to make sure that we're using what we already have. A lot of times we're running parallel, and it's not by design, but it happens. That investment in time and communicating is so important. And I think that's what I appreciate it personally. And I think we're trying here to share our own, kind of experiences, and their opinions. They're not black and white. So people shouldn't take it the wrong way. Sometimes we'll say something that's a little bit from our experience. But those are my thoughts, that I think the relationship and spending a few minutes with companies that are users, and that way they'll likely increase the usage.
I think you're spot on. That private-public alignment, partnership, collaboration, whatever you want to call it, that's really what the Soy Aquaculture Alliance aims to be, is that connector. So I think that's so important. Sergio, any additional comments?
Well, again, I think Jason summarizes everything so well. But everything begins with an honest conversation. So if you don't have an honest conversation, and you have, like Jason said, you have to agree to disagree. In the world, we all have our own opinions and our own personal experiences. Something that we always have to, like he said, we have to build those bridges between, private industry, in the case, for example, of us, between Riverruns, Rankin, and Prairie Aquatech, but also between us, associations such as USEC, and having conferences like this one, and then also universities, R&D. And we have to come to the table and figure out how we work together. Flip side of that coin, and I was talking to Mark Luke, our CEO, this morning, is private companies tend to keep part of what generated in terms of R&D as confidential, because it gives them competitive advantage. So how we find common ground, that there's enough information out there that we can share with the competition, and of course with universities and associations, that will benefit the entire industry. And it sounds philosophically, but at the end of the day, this planet, because we only have one planet. So it's how we're going to benefit society, how we're going to benefit industry and humans as a whole, So, it's very philosophical, but yeah.
I think you said that perfectly. And I would be remiss, and I know I'm channeling my inner Kenlon. He would want to remind the audience that the Soy Aquaculture Alliance does provide technical briefs on the website, that summarize research done in the last 3 to 5 years. So it's important to know what's out there. It's a great catalog. They have short 2 to 3 page summaries and full reports. So if you haven't checked that out or are ever looking for information, don't hesitate to go there or reach out to us. Thank you so much for our nutritionist panel. We're going to transition to our third and final panel, which is going to bring us the industry perspective. We have 2 panelists. We have Sebastian Bell, who's the Executive Director for the Maine Aquaculture Association, and Peter Fritsch, who's the president of Rushing Waters Fisheries. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian. We'd love to hear your perspective.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Courtney. And thank you, everybody, for hosting us today. Great meeting, all-star panels, and very hard act to follow and add anything to, frankly. I will tell you right off the bat that I am the least qualified of your panelists. I am not a nutritionist. And I am just basically a farmer who was washed up on shore. But what I'm going to do today is try and paint a little bit of a picture about where I think we're headed as a sector from the farmer's perspective, and where some opportunities might be for you folks to think about. I will share my screen. I think somebody has to stop sharing their screen. Yeah, okay, I got it. Here we go. Let's see, bingo. Okay. So.
There you go, we see your slides.
Great, thank you very much. I run a farmers association called the Maine Aquaculture Association. We're the oldest state aquaculture association in the country. Our members raise finfish, shellfish, and seaweed. And we have roughly 190 farms on any given year that are represented by the association. We have been at the forefront from a policy point of view at a national level in trying to drive the conversation about where, in particular, marine aquaculture should go in this country. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to just take a slightly different tack and map out for you where I think the sector as a whole is going, and it is going very fast. The level of change which is occurring in our field from a farmer's perspective is really blistering. And I think about it when I first got into this 35 years ago, after being 10 years in the seafood industry. We were growing fish in homemade cages, or in some cases, naturally occurring ponds or streams. All of that has gone by the wayside in most cases, and we are now entering a highly engineered world where the level of sophistication of management from a farmer's perspective, the kinds of qualifications that we as farmers have to have, is dramatically evolving and increasing, frankly. And so the do-it-yourself approach that we all started with is becoming more and more difficult to use, and it's really being driven both by the technical possibilities and also by the regulatory climate and the concerns that consumers have about where their food is coming from. So why haven't we grown faster in the United States? And I think there are a number of different reasons. You know, aquaculture in the US has grown roughly 1% per year over the last 20 years versus a rough 7 to 8% growth globally in other parts of the world. For one reason, I think there are cheaper places to invest in farms than the United States, and that's driven in part by our regulatory climate, perhaps the cost of real estate, and also cost of labor compared to other places in the world. We also, compared to some of our competitors in other countries, don't have as many risk management tools as they do. There are less tools out there that we can use to mitigate risk in the field, and our field is a risky field. You're growing living animals in a environment that sometimes you don't have as much control over as some of our other types of food producing methods. I would say that in the US, compared to other countries, we also have a lack of experienced investors and operators. And that may be somewhat of a controversial statement, but if you compare how young people are coming up in our field in this country to how they are coming up in other countries, coming out of technical training programs or programs that are designed to give hands-on experience, we don't have a lot of those programs in this country. And so that's resulted in a lot of people coming into at the entry level of the industry with very little training and very little experience. And there are a couple of other reasons why we haven't grown, I think, as fast as some of our competitors, not the least of which is we have not had a national economic development program focused on aquaculture. And many of our competitors have. Many of our competitors have actually used aquaculture as a rural development tool and put tremendous government support into key bottlenecks in the development of that sector. And so we've never kind of taken that approach at a national level. And there is a discussion now amongst the growing community, as well as some of the policy folks, about the need for a national economic development plan focused on the aquaculture sector, in much the same way as we had economic development plans focused on terrestrial agriculture on and off over the years. In terms of what it's going to take to grow the sector in the US, these points are mostly focused on the marine sector, but I would argue that some of them are also relevant to land-based aquaculture. One of the things which is unique about Maine as a state is we have virtually every form of production method that is used in finfish culture is in the state. So we have net pens. We have over $1 billion worth of investment going into land-based RAS systems in the next 5 to 8 years. We have ocean-based closed containment systems that are being proposed and licensed currently, and then we do have some land-based raceway systems as well. So what is unique, I think, about the marine environment is, and I think Jason alluded to this, is you need to apply for some form of license to use public waters, and security of tenure of that license, whether it's a license or a lease, is very important to the farmer and to the investor. If you don't feel that that license or lease has some security of tenure and goes for a long enough period of time that you can gain back your investment, then you are probably not going to invest. And that is really what I would argue is held back marine aquaculture in particular in this country, is the security of tenure issue. We also are competing against some folks in other countries that have highly subsidized hatchery and breeding programs. If you look at the new species which are coming online, many times the hatchery side of that production chain is initially subsidized in its early days and then becomes privatized over time. And we have a couple of instances where we have those kinds of programs in place. We have a catfish breeding program and a salmon breeding program. But as new species come into production, we're going to need some breeding programs and early subsidized hatcheries in those species. We also don't have a lot of investment incentives in this country compared to some of the other countries. I can remember when I was building farms in Europe, I could walk into Ireland, for example, and get up to 50% of my investment or my investor's investment as an outright grant, not a loan, but a grant as part of an economic development program. So that's the kind of thing that we're competing against from other countries. So what do feeds have to do with all of this? And this is really my take on feeds from a farmer's perspective. And I do want to start by just saying that I think Jason really put his finger on the key elements with respect to soy as an ingredient and how that how that as an ingredient could be increased. But I do want to mention a couple of specific issues that we have certainly seen over the years. And one is, it's not just what the ingredient is, it's the quality of the ingredient. And certainly from a consumer's perspective and from a buyer's perspective, people are asking quite technical questions about feed composition and how it reflects itself in the quality of the end product. And a classic example of that would be omega-3 levels in the finished product based on what your feed ingredient composition and balance is. And omega-3s are an issue. We now have buyers that are testing omega-3 levels in the finished product and building that into their buying contract. Number of people have talked about nutrient management, and I just want to say that nutrient management is an issue for all production systems. So it applies differently to different production systems, but obviously in land-based RAS production systems, it has big implications on how that production system functions and the quality of the waste discharge that you have. But it also has implications for open cage systems and the level of permit requirements you have, and how you manage your open system in relationship to the ecosystem in which it is submerged. And there is a relationship between the farm and the ecosystem, which is very important and dictates carrying capacity for that site, that farm, and literally reflects itself all the way through into discharge parameters in your permits that will limit the amount of production or the type of production you can have on a site. From a farmer's perspective, if you think about costs and feed costs, it's not just the cost of the feed per se, but it's also the FCRs. Does shifting feed composition have impacts on survivability or mortality? So it's not just feed costs per se, but it's also how does it interact with the rest of the production chain and the production value. And particularly with respect to mortality or survivability, immunostimulants are areas where farmers are beginning to pay increasing amounts of attention to. And I will just say very pragmatically, I think there has been some snake oil in the immunostimulant world, but there is good data starting to come out now where immunostimulants do have an impact on survival rates and particularly the ability of animals to resist disease challenges. And that is going to become a factor increasingly, I think, in farmers' choices about what feed formulations they are willing to purchase. Certainly the microbiome impacts and how they impact in particular RAS systems and filter biology. It is something that we've got a lot to learn about. We are learning about it now, but with the levels of investments that are going into these systems and the scales of investments that are going into these systems, the scales of the filtration technology and the complicatedness of the microbiomes in some of those filters, the relationship between feed formulation, feed ingredients, and the microbiome in the RAS filtration systems is going to be very important, particularly given the fact that as larger and larger systems are built, the risks associated with catastrophic system failure, a particular filter failure, become larger and larger. And so that relationship between the microbiome and the feed going into the system is a very important one. Something that hasn't been mentioned yet at all, and I lived through the PCB contaminant time in the feed world, and I will tell you from a farmer's perspective, we are writing contaminant levels into our feed costs, our feed contracts, and we are testing our feeds for contaminants. And the reason we're doing that is because we do not want to go through another PCB experience. And right now, one of the things that people are most concerned about are PFAS contaminant levels, and that's impacted by how you're managing your soil, what your fertilizer sources are, and where you're located geographically compared to discharges. So be aware that contaminant risks are something that farmers are thinking about all the time. Different species call for different diets, and different production methods call for different diets. No rocket science there. I want to make the point that offshore in particular is not a new environment. This is 1994 off Wachapreet, Virginia. And this was a cage raising tuna as part of a research project. We've been operating in offshore environments for quite some time now. And where the future is going, and you folks have actually done some really interesting work around the use of soy in tuna. These are tuna cages off Australia, where we were building some farms there years ago. I think there is a lot of opportunity, particularly in the marine species. Although there are challenges with soy as an ingredient, you're going to see some pretty dramatic growth in this space. And I'll give you a couple of real world examples. This is an old project off the coast of France where a bulk carrier was converted to a floating fish farm. This is the new version of that technology currently being built in China. And the company in China is building 30 of these vessels, which are able to grow fish in the vessels and deliver the fish live to the market that they are exporting to. You know, a couple of years ago, people thought this was a crazy idea, but these vessels are being built as we speak. A couple of other renditions here. On the top is the Ocean One, built by an old buddy of mine, Gustav Witso from Salmar, and the bottom one is a different design. Both of these are designed to be in high energy offshore sites with very large volumes. This is the kind of concept from Salmar. It's a very automated version of net pen rearing. And this is the real deal. I visited Gustav last year, just before COVID, and this is the Ocean One deployed offshore in a relatively sheltered site right now, but the next version that they're deploying is going to be in the open North Sea. The reason I mention these technologies is from a cost of production point of view, they are increasingly competitive with the conventional net pens. And if you think about the space that is available for this kind of technology, it is a game changer, in my opinion, in terms of the volumes of fish that are going to be produced, particularly in marine environments. So I will end there, and glad to answer any questions. The lower left-hand picture is a picture of one of our salmon farms here in Maine, and the right-hand pictures are pictures of some of our other farmers here in Maine. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Very good thoughts. And I love the visuals. It's just fascinating, especially what is happening in China with those vessels. Our next speaker is Peter Fritsch, the president of Rushing Waters Fishery. Peter, we look forward to your comments before we move into some Q&A.
All right. Thanks, Courtney. You can hear me okay?
You betcha.
Well, thanks for having me here at the end. I get to be the tail of this call. I feel like Sebastian, I don't know how much, if I have enough experience to be with this panel, but I got a pretty good little story to tell. So I think that's the takeaway. And as Jason mentioned, and Sebastian again, part of the bridging the gap between a lot of research and science to the private sector and what we've done on our farm. It's a pretty good story. So I think with that, should I share my screen? Are we ready?
Yep. There we go. We can see your slides.
All right. So again, thanks for having me, Peter Fritsch, Rushing Waters. So we're in Palmyra, Wisconsin, kind of a southern part of Wisconsin. The quick overall operation, just so you kind of know who we are. We are, here's our world headquarters. We got 80 acres, 56 ponds. We're raising rainbow trout for food. We harvest everything right on site. It's processed. We do a lot of value added. But today I just want to give you a little background before we get into our challenges and kind of why I'm on this panel. So another shot here, just showing you me in a tie-dye shirt and a nice weather in the summer, giving a little tour. Earthen ponds, open to nature. It's pretty much what we do. The highest tech thing we have is some round tanks that we have in our hatcheries. And again, these are all rainbow trout. Flow through system, really basic, kind of the exact opposite of what we were just looking at, what's happening maybe off the coast of Maine. This is old technology, been around for thousands of years. And kind of what we get into is, why we're here. I guess this is where the rubber hits the road, as they would say. A lot of these technologies that we've been talking about, they've got to find their way to people like me, and they got to get into farms like ours. And I think that's challenging. You know, I have a really hard, I mean, I'm not even as smart as anybody on this panel, but for me to kind of watch what's going on, but yet I can make pretty good decisions on our farm and what we got to do. And that's really what brings us to today, is that our farm has been here. So 1994, they've been raising fish here though since the 30s, but really in 96, Wisconsin, you know, we got a Wisconsin pollution discharge elimination permit here, WPDS permit. And the DNR, because we were small, there's not a lot of aquaculture happening in Wisconsin. We got to a point where they weren't sure what to do with us. But as time went on and there was some, you know, misinformation, misunderstanding, we now have a phosphorus limit 0.075. And again, this is not different than a lot of other regions in the country. It was new for Wisconsin. And our groundwater in the area right now, as you can see, it averages about 0.029. And we're not able to subtract that. And there's a couple things that we talk about when we get together with farmers. Probably within 10 minutes of being at a establishment, once we have our drinks, it's talking about business. We'll start talking about feed. We talk about discharge. You know, state by state, things are different. But we got to a point here where our phosphorus discharge was a little bit higher. And we started looking at some choices. And one of the choices was we could reduce production. And just so everyone knows, we were running about a 0.22 milligram per liter. And, you know, reducing production didn't seem like what I wanted to do for part of our farm, obviously. Then we could also spend money on phosphorus removal. I was actually given some plans by the state of Wisconsin that, I mean, it wasn't a big deal, $3-4 million. I could just add a little system to the end of my farm. But again, that wasn't in the budget, let's say. So then we investigate inputs and feed. And again, so when we're getting together at these different conferences and stuff and talking about feed, you know, we're talking about, you know, where are you getting your feed from? For the first time, probably 3-4 years ago, farmers, we actually were talking about ingredients. And that was a game changer, I think, because it was who's getting your feed, you know, who gave you the hat, who gave you the new shirt. Let's just be honest. Anyway, then it was what ingredients are you using? And when we started looking at that, honestly, you know, ME Pro, it was mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, I can't remember the exact time I got introduced to this South Dakota company, but I'll tell you what, I was all ears. And again, you know, this kind of started, I wasn't looking, you know, I didn't wake up in the morning and say, you know what I want to do? I want to feed more soybeans. That's not what I did. I don't know if anyone really does that, to be honest with you, but I had a challenge. I had a problem, and to fix it, I had a new awesome domestic high protein digestibility, everything that we know about it, and then ME Pro. So sure, let's put this in a feed. And Prairie Aquatech actually made my feed for the first couple of years. Their ingredient wasn't, I don't want to say wasn't commercially available, but we were helping to try it. And you know, one thing that we'll talk about here, here's a page right out of their playbook, but I just mentioned our challenge and phosphorus. You know, I didn't get up in the morning and say, you know what I want to do is feed soybeans, but what I wanted to do was get my discharge lower. And we just started with, you know, 6 of our 56 ponds, but we did 6 ponds against 6 ponds, and we saw great numbers. And then you can see over time, we got our discharge down, and it lowered by 69%. It's actually even lower today. And by simply adding this ingredient into our feeds, we've made our discharge parameters. We're very happy. You know, this, out of those couple scenarios I showed you, this is amazing. So just having that was amazing, but something else happened. So I just mentioned the phosphorus. We also sell, one of our biggest customers is Whole Foods, and they have a fish in, fish out ratio. Many of you probably know what that is. It's a way of kind of judging aquaculture. You know, we get hit on for taking fish out of the ocean, grinding them up, producing fish meal, and feeding it in. Well, when you're doing some factors and some pretty complicated formulas, they give you a fish in, fish out ratio. We're under 1-to-1 now, so we're a protein gain, and again, that gain is coming out of this ingredient that's driven by soybeans. So that's been huge, and to make the fish out ratio, the phosphorus reduction. Our farm here, we've got an on-site restaurant, we've got a store, we interact with a lot of customers. And again, customers now are blessed with lots of information, and lots of information can also be not always the right information. So you start having these conversations with people, and they're kind of all ears, because it's kind of new in the industry. And then, somebody walks into our store and they want to tell me that farm-raised fish is horrible. I love those conversations, because I can actually say, well, actually, here's a little story for you. And then we walk on the farm, which is 150 yards from where I'm sitting. So that's one example of what's happened here on the farm. A good private company relationship that happened, and just a great partnership. The second thing we've done, and we're going to kind of end with this one, where there's some more work to do here, is that we did an imprinting, 100% start to finish. Rainbow trout was grown with no fish meal. We had to have help from again, Prairie Aquatech. They did the imprinting work on these fish, and then we finished them off on our farm for the last about 9 to 10 months. And honestly, I will tell you, I was a little skeptical. We tried another fish meal free diet about 15 years ago that did not end well. So we were a little skeptical. My crew on the farm was very skeptical. But at the end of the day, this is the quick summary here, and there's a ton of information out there to look at here, but did about 20,000 rainbow trout. So one thing I always say, and for those of you who know me, is I'm a big fan of science and experiments and things, but it's got to be at a certain level. We always read about, I call them science fair experiments. Someone raises 10 fish in a lab, and oh, that's great. But this was, much larger than a science fair experiment. And, 20,000 fry imprinted, 20,000 from our farm. They all got together here. And the takeaway was, at the end of the day, we had chefs, restaurants, they were irreplaceable. You couldn't tell one from the other. But again, for growth, mortality, everything, they were literally side by side. And again, to get those kind of results on a farm, production size, it's pretty good. So there's a lot of work to be done here. I think this needs to be continued on, but we did it. And again, fish meal has some higher phosphorus again than the ME Pro. So this is potentially going to be even better for phosphorus and things down the road. But this was huge. And another thing that no one really talks about is, I mentioned most farmers haven't talked about ingredients kind of over time, but it's changed a little bit. But there were times we talked about ingredients. This same discussion was a little bit different probably 15 years ago with corn. The corn grower associations, they had some great new products coming out, and many of us, because the diets and the feed companies switched, we started calling back in about 4 to 5 months. We had yellow fish. Hey, too much corn. We dialed it in. Now corn's a great, it can be used, but very little amounts. I don't know if we know how much can be used. And again, we got the science and all these research people that are helping us, but the soy inclusion is far higher. And as a farmer, again, where we're doing all these fish for food, I'm looking at thousands of fish coming through my fillet machine, and they look beautiful. They're very consistent. So those are things that we're seeing with the soy inclusion, which we didn't see that before when we were playing with other ingredients. So right now, again, from quality, appearance, texture, and taste, as it says, everything was really kind of boring. And in this industry, boring is pretty good. So, my last slide just says next steps. I'm not sure where to go from here. I'm running a business, but I can tell you that me and my farm, we'd like to be involved, and we're really happy. And honestly, soy has been a huge component of our business to keep us where we're at. So we're quite pleased. So I think that's what I got, Courtney. Under my 10 minutes, I think.
You did good. Really good insights. And we have a number of questions that have developed. First, Sebastian, I want to follow up on a couple things. You provided a number of limiting factors for reasons that the U.S. industry hasn't reached the level of outside of the United States. So how can the soy industry best partner with aquaculture companies and groups to expand the understanding of the real opportunity we have in the United States? How do we set reasonable expectations, goals, and stretch goals?
Great question. I think the simple answer is partner with the National Aquaculture Association, because they are driving at a national policy level what the actual growers are pushing for. And so I would, unfortunately, our sector has had a divided voice at the national policy level. And there are other groups who have pushed for things that, at least from the growers' perspective, are not helpful. And so I would say partner with the NAA, help them push at a national policy level in DC. The NAA is unique in that it represents all forms of aquaculture production in the country. And if you look at their board of directors, it's a very experienced board of directors. They've been around for a long time, and they have become much more active at a policy level nationally than they were historically, which is a great thing. I think they needed to become more active, and they have. So that certainly is one thing to do. The other thing I think is, one of the things I think we need to do from a sector point of view is, and we're talking about this both at NAA and some of the state associations, is begin to invest in young leaders in the sector. We need to, much the same way as, for example, the National Fisheries Institute has a young leaders program, we need to do the same kinds of things in our sector so that the next generation of farmers have the tools they need to advocate for the policies, the rules and regulations that allow them to do business in a sustainable and economically viable way. So I would encourage Soy Association to start to think about how can they help the aquaculture sector begin to build programs that invest in young leaders in the sector. And then the final thing is, we've got to find a way to straighten out authorities at the federal level between the different agencies. We have duplication of efforts between agencies, and that is killing us. In the case of marine aquaculture, depending on who you talk to, there are at least 3, and there may be as many as 5 different agencies that are claiming some form of authority over the sector, and that's gotta stop. It's duplicative, and it is negatively impacting investor confidence with respect to investing in the sector. So anything that your folks can do to help us with that. And I think the Department of Agriculture, which is obviously the department which your folks are intimately connected with, has a really important role to play. And I'll give you one example. There are currently 3 agencies that claim authority over aquatic animal health in the country. But the USDA is the competent authority under the international treaty, the OIE. It should only be USDA that has authority over aquatic animal health. It should not be U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It should not be NOAA Fisheries. And in some cases, it shouldn't even be state regulatory agencies, because by having different laws, rules, and regulations on a state-by-state basis, and by having 3 agencies which are conflicting with each other around aquatic animal health, it's very difficult for the farmer to know what they have to comply with unless they only operate in one state and don't transfer animals across state lines. So that's an example of where you've got this triple duplication of regulations that has to be sorted out as quickly as possible.
All very good thoughts. Peter, any additional comments on that from your perspective?
No, not really. I think that's a good summary. I don't have anything else. Sorry.
No worries, because the next question's for you. We think about when we work with our actual farmers and consumers as, the customer journey. So you stated that soybeans wasn't your intent when you woke up in the morning as the solution you were seeking, but you knew you had a problem. In the decision-making process or the value assessment, did you assess where the soybeans originated from, or were you just intent on using soy in your diets once you knew it would be viable for your system?
Oh, good question. So our business, we are as local as possible. I mean, hence building the restaurant here so that we could talk about food yards compared to food miles. So we wanted to be domestic. Everything we do is, again, being local. So that was a pretty easy choice. And again, we've got great domestic products here available. So that was easy for us.
Great. Yeah, I think that we are very lucky here in the U.S. to have an ample domestic supply of high quality soybeans and associated products. And that's a big conversation on the international side that we focus on is differentiating U.S. soy on its intrinsic and extrinsic value components. So interesting perspective. Last but not least, the topic of feed testing has kind of come up many times. So, how can traceability within the supply chain, something that's consistent, so that's as consistent as U.S. soy. How can we help support farmer acceptance and confidence? What level of traceability is really needed in this case that would be effective, but maybe not overly burdensome?
All right, I'll take a little stab. For a lot of our customers, I think the next thing will be the non-GMO. That's what's coming up now. So our customers are very happy that it's domestic. That's step one we just talked about. I think the next step is going to be that verifying that if Rushing Waters, for example, is going to say all of our soybeans are non-GMO. To be honest, I don't exactly know how all the testing and certification is, but that's what I see as probably the next thing, just to make sure we can stand behind any claims or certifications. And I'll need help from feed mills and suppliers.
Very good points. Sebastian, thoughts on your end?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Peter. I think traceability is going to be the name of the game, and verification of that. We have the challenge, I think, from a farmer's perspective is if you reach a certain volume from a tonnage point of view, you are selling to multiple buyers, and different buyers have different certification systems or levels, if you will. And so it's not unusual here in Maine, at least, for us to have audits, once a month from different organizations on our farms. That gets to be expensive. It's the farmer which is bearing that cost. So there has to be, I think, some rationalization in the certification world, if you will, and the costs of that verification have to be reasonable, and the buying community has to be willing to contribute to those costs as well. And so far, as farmers, we try and reflect that cost in our price, but the reality is we have often not been paid for the verification that we pay for. And this idea, particularly the environmental community, I think early on in the traceability and verification system, we're telling farmers, look, you're going to get paid more for your product. And it's really not that simple. There's a lot of price point issues out there, and verification is not cheap. It's expensive to do. But when a buyer says, I won't buy from you unless you have that, you as a farmer don't have a lot of choice and have to do that. So traceability and verification, I think, are the name of the game. And, the great thing about the domestic supplies is there's both compliance with a high level of regulatory monitoring and overseeing in the US, but there's also farmer-driven sustainability programs, and soy has been out in front on some of that stuff. So I really think that that's an advantage that soy has over some of the other ingredient groups from a down through the chain, if you will, verification process. So kudos to the soy farmers of the US for doing that.
Definitely, and we will pass that along to them. They'll be pleased to hear that. Final question. We opened up this seminar today with saying this is a dialogue. This is to identify key questions. So it's really the continuation of a conversation here about U.S. soy and the domestic aquaculture industry and how we can best work together. So as you two look at the market landscape, what other conversations would be helpful to move this topic forward, and at what frequency?
I guess I get to go first. I think just continuing doing what we're doing. I'll mention this. I'm really, like everybody, happy to be hopefully in the post-pandemic region. I look forward to attending another conference. I know when people get together, ideas, informations, things are shared. It's fantastic. And out of those conversations come the next steps, like I mentioned on my last slide. So I think a big point for me is that, I have a hard time communicating directly with science and scientists. We're on different levels, however. So you gotta have those middle people to bridge these gaps. And that usually happens at different conferences and things. So I think we keep doing what we're doing. We got a great team of people, and there's so many people that are looking into how to make this better. But then I will raise my hand. I need help getting it to my farm, and that's I need help. I can say that. Took me like 20 years to ask for help, but I need help. And sometimes I don't exactly know where to go for that help. Someone will tell me, "Oh, there's a white paper done on that." I don't know what a white paper is. I'm sorry. So I think just the Soy Aquaculture Alliance. I mean, honestly, I need to be more familiar with what you do and what's out there, and that's personally on me too. So we just all need to keep the conversation going, and I'll be the first to do that. You'll find me at the next conference. We'll get together. So thanks again.
Excellent. Sebastian, thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. And I completely agree with Peter on getting the science to the farmer and putting it in terms that a farmer can use in their business. And what that means, frankly, is extension, right? It's the extension. The tradition of agricultural extension in this country is one of the strongest extension traditions in the world. We need to build that same tradition around aquaculture. And there are people who are doing it. USDA, with some of their facilities, certainly we heard from some of the folks who've worked for USDA early on in this seminar. We've got a USDA breeding center up here in Maine that's also doing nutritional work, and forming alliances with universities that are structured to be linked to the industry. And I'll give you an example. In Maine, we formed a bunch of years ago an aquaculture research institute, and the purpose of that institute was to be cross-disciplinary within the university, but also to build the relationship with the private sector. And they've just hired, actually, of interest to you folks, they've just hired 2 nutritionists. So we've now gone into the nutrition game here in Maine, which we have not done historically. And then I think that conversation with the private sector and the scientific community, and then getting that information out to the farmer sector is what makes the difference. And without that last piece, that translates the science into usable information for the farmer, is probably the most important piece of the process.
Well said. Well, thank you to you both. Really appreciate you, as well as the other panelists. We're coming into the home stretch of this seminar. I want to turn it over to the Soy Aquaculture Alliance's Executive Director, Mr. Kenlin Johannes. I know you have some closing remarks for us, and we look forward to them. So take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Courtney. And thank you for all attending this virtual forum. I hope it's triggered some conversations. It certainly has for our board of directors. I am Kenlin Johannes, Executive Director of the Soy Aquaculture Alliance, and I want to give a big thank you to our panelists and to our moderator. We appreciate you taking the time to share your insights with us today and for challenging us to critically think about what's next for soy and aquaculture. Another thank you to our board of directors and to the members of SAA, and especially the Ohio Soybean Council, for helping sponsor this event. And I'd be remiss without thanking Tiffany and Kimberly and the rest of the Blank Page marketing team for all their hard work behind the scenes to help make this event happen. Thank you for that. Our board and members drive our research investment decisions. As Jerry said at the beginning, we're really here to answer the questions that you all pose to drive an increased use of our U.S. soybeans. Our partnerships with leading companies, researchers, and organizations across aquaculture, farm, and feed areas is important to us. We want to be a catalyst for bringing everyone to the table to move all industries forward. A domestically supplied quality feedstuff beneficial to the feed manufacturer as much as it benefits the fish farmer. And for our soybean farmers, a growing market's always a good thing. Jerry also mentioned we hope to spark some conversations and ideas for new research. We welcome your input, and if you have any questions you think we might be able to answer with a new research project, please reach out to us. You can reach me at johannes@soyaquaculture.org. And if you have any additional questions, please send them to info@soyaquaculture.org, and that's on our website. Once again, thank you for participating today and for your thoughtful questions. We hope to do this again in the future. Have a wonderful day, and thank you all.
Thank you, Kenlon. Thank you, everybody. Again, this will be available on soyaquaculture.com, and you will get an email as a follow-up since you registered. Again, there's a number of resources on their website, and you know how to contact them now. So let's continue the dialogue. Everyone have a great day, a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Courtney.
Mm-hmm.